Hello, and thank you for joining us on this episode of Inside View. I'm Cory Burnell, and I'll be your host. And we are privileged on this episode to have our Congressman, Tom McClintock, joining us to answer a bunch of questions and describe to us what's going on in Washington, D.C. and also around the state and your district. So thank you very much.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Cory, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, well, it's always a pleasure for us to have you. So, one of the hot topics, you might say, literally hot, is, of course, the wildfires that are going on here, really ravaging all over your district. Mm-hmm. So we know that you've spent some time at one of the command centers today, and of course this is an issue many of your constituents, I'm sure, are bringing up with you wherever you go. Mm-hmm. What do we do about the wildfires? Can you just kind of give us an idea of your take on the status and what you're seeing?
Donnell Fire Command Center, and it's the same old story that we hear over and over again at these massive mega fires. Densely overgrown forests. This particular region has 300 trees per acre. Your normal acre in the Sierra should hold about 80 to 100 trees if it's healthy management. Mm-hmm. They've got 300 per acre up there, and it hasn't been logged since the 1950s. And it just proves once again that old maxim that all of the excess timber comes out of a forest one way or the other. It's either carried out or it burns out, but it came out. We used to carry it out, and that provided healthy, thriving forests. It also provided a thriving, prosperous economy for our mountain communities, mm-hmm. and it produced a significant revenue stream for the federal government and for local governments, because we would auction off the excess timber. We would actually be paid for people to come in and take out that excess timber. And the result was 25% of those revenues went to local communities like this, and the other 75% went to the federal treasury to support the Forest Service. People forget, until we changed the laws and stopped proper forest management, the Forest Service actually was a revenue generator. It didn't cost us anything to manage our forests. The forests actually made money. But then we changed the laws in the 1970s, all with the promise that this would improve the forest environment. It has made the active management of our forests endlessly time-consuming and ultimately cost-prohibitive. We've seen an 80% decline in timber harvested off of the public lands in that period, and we've seen a concomitant increase in acreage destroyed by fire. Mm-hmm. And that's the great frustration. We know how to properly manage a forest. We did so for generations. But with the rise of the environmental movement in the 1970s, we threw all of that learning away and basically consigned our forests to a condition of benign neglect. Now, we've had those laws in place now for 45 years. And I think we're entitled to ask, since they promised it would improve the forest environment, how's the forest environment doing? And the answer is absolutely devastating. We're losing our forests.
Yeah, perfectly legitimate question, right? I mean, if we've interjected or imposed policies, well, have they been successful?
Yeah.
And miserable failure, as we witness each summer. One thing I wanted to talk about is the frequency. Every summer, it almost becomes to a point where, well, I don't really pay attention much anymore to the fact that there's a wildfire going on because they're so frequent. So you've touched on some of the causes of the frequency.
And it comes down to this. We're only carrying out about 20% of the annual growth of our forests. So 80% of the annual growth has been building up year after year in our forests. Now, let me put it to you this way. If I delivered 5 newspapers to your doorstep every morning and you only threw one of them away, mm-hmm. how long would it take for your house to become a fire trap? That's the condition of our national forest today. And the frustrating thing is, if you compare that to privately managed land that's not subject to all of these environmental laws, you see much healthier forests that are resistant to fires and much more resilient to fires when they do strike. I just toured the footprint of the King Fire, which happened about 5 years ago. The private lands are all completely cleared. They've suppressed the brush buildup. and they've planted new trees. And now you have a young, healthy, growing forest where the land was free to be and managed privately. The public lands that are subject to these environmental laws are simply abandoned. They now have 5 to 8 feet of brush. The dead trees have never been removed, so they're now falling down on top of that dead brush, and we're creating a perfect fire stack for a second generation fire.
Well, no,
that's simply not good management.
Oh, certainly not. And the laws that are essentially prohibiting us from proper forest management, are they all federal, or are there California laws also?
There are California laws as well, but NEPA and ESA, the National Environmental Policy Act and the Endangered Species Act, have pretty much made it impossible for us to manage our forests, and so now they've become morbidly overgrown, and they're dying. A single pine tree that's got a 5-inch diameter requires 50 gallons of water a day in order to stay healthy. You have an overcrowded forest where you've got 4 times the density of trees that the land can support.
And then drought conditions for years.
And then the drought comes.
Right.
You've got a dead forest. And that's been the story of the Sierra. And it's a tragic one because it was preventable. And not only was it preventable, it could have provided not only healthy forests, but the thriving economy that the mountain communities knew when we were selling that excess timber. It was being milled into lumber here in our mountain communities and then sent around the country. And that's another thing. You look at the enormous stock of timber that we have in our national forests and realize that the United States has now become the second largest importer of softwood timber in the world. You begin to realize how bad these laws have been. And I'll tell you another story. I was at the Tahoe Summit this past week. I was talking to a fellow named Graham Kent. He runs a group called Alert Tahoe. They're the ones that place the early detection infrared cameras throughout the forest so that they can spot a fire just as it starts. If you can do that and get equipment out there right away, you can prevent the kind of conflagration that is now ravaging our region. He says this is simply a matter of posting early detection cameras in the forest. What are the 2 greatest obstacles he says he faces in doing this? National Environmental Policy Act, which is a federal law, and the California Environmental Quality Act, that's a state law. Now, when our laws are preventing the placement of equipment that is absolutely essential to early fire detection and fire suppression, there's something very much wrong with our laws.
That's incredible. Now, so we're identifying essentially the problems here. Some of the solutions, let's investigate that. I mean, we have a Republican House and U.S. Senate.
And that's the good news.
Yeah.
I wrote legislation 2 years ago to grant a categorical exclusion from NEPA for forest thinning projects for fire prevention. Unfortunately, because of all the negotiations that had to take place, we could only get it for the Tahoe Basin. But it became law, December of 2016. The Forest Service is now using that new authority, and they are raving about it. The regional manager for District 5 tells me that has taken their environmental assessment, just to do a simple tree thinning project, from 800 pages down to less than 40 pages. And they've been able to permit the first project which in just 4 months, which is a tiny fraction of the amount of time it normally takes under these laws. So they're actually now able to pursue forest thinning in the Tahoe Basin, and hopefully with enough time to prevent a massive fire there. But the success that they're having at Tahoe under the legislation I wrote, I think is going to give us a very, very strong case to make to extend that authority throughout the western United States.
When you say the negotiations, was the roadblock basically that
you have the environmental left, and they still have a stranglehold on the Senate. You need 60 votes in the Senate to get anything done, and they still maintain a stranglehold there.
Last time you were here, we spoke about that cloture vote, the 60 votes needed to and debate and how that needed to be remedied.
Right. But we were able to get it into law, at least for one of our forests. It is working spectacularly, and now I think we have a very strong case to make, particularly with this summer of fires, that we need to go back to scientific management of our forests, get them healthy again, get them fire resistant, and get them resilient. Meanwhile, of course, the House has passed a great deal of legislation on this subject. I chair the Federal Land Subcommittee. We do have a much broader categorical exclusion that's contained in the the Resilient Federal Forests Act. It's now passed the House in 2 separate sessions of the Congress, but both times it comes to a screeching halt in the Senate over opposition from the environmental left. And that's the real tragedy. And I probably ought to say the so-called environmental left, because they've done it. They've not only failed to protect our environment, their laws have done irreparable harm to the environment.
Right. Well, in prevention, we need healthy forests. Now, what do we do where I just read there's actually a suspect arrested for possibly starting one of these fires, a 51-year-old man, and I've often wondered, are California wildfires and our lands, are they a target for domestic terrorism at any point? Is that a concern?
Not just domestic terrorism, but
Sure.
we're hearing reports of foreign terrorists
Sure.
being trained for that very purpose. And don't forget, during World War II, a major objective of the Japanese was to send fire balloons, basically balloons filled with incendiary devices, into the Pacific Northwest to set fires. And they were very successful at that. The news was suppressed during the war, but it was part of their offensive against the United States. And now we're getting reports that the Islamic terror organizations are starting to target these forests. Back in the 40s, they were well maintained and much more difficult to ignite into the major forest fires we have than we're seeing today. But yeah, it's a prime target and it ought to be a great concern to all of us. And again, it gets right back to that same point, and that is if the forest is properly managed, it has a great deal of natural resistance. We've been talking about fire, but one of the big threats is bark beetles.
Well, yeah, we see it here.
Bark beetles are not a problem for a healthy tree. A bark beetle burrows into the bark, the tree exudes sap, and that is the beginning and the end of that bark beetle infestation. But if the tree is stressed, particularly, as I said, when you need 50 gallons of water a day just to support a single pine tree with a 5-inch diameter, if it doesn't have that water, it can't exude that sap, and then you have a beetle infestation that wipes out an entire forest. And then you've got a whole bunch of dead trees, 139 million dead trees in the Sierra, according to the most recent count I've seen, just waiting to burn. And ultimately they do.
It seems like such common sense, the notion of forestry management, or even the idea of reducing from 300 trees an acre down to maybe 80's healthy, but can we get the enviros to agree to 150 an acre or something like that? I mean, is there really just such a disconnect between reason from some of these people on the left that they just cannot be negotiated? Or I guess, what are the real political motivations that are
it's a completely
going on behind the scenes?
It's basically the reason we established the U.S. Forest Service was because we wanted to preserve our forests for each generation. We wanted to maintain them healthy and resilient and vital so that every generation could enjoy them. That's why we have public lands. In the words of the original Yosemite Charter, they are for public use, resort, and recreation for all time. The problem is, left to a complete state of nature, to benign neglect, you have catastrophic wildfires that come out, and you have the catastrophic overcrowding that leaves the trees susceptible to disease and pestilence, and then you have wildfire come in and periodically take them out. Once it does, it takes well over a century for the forests to regrow on their own. New trees don't have first claim on fire-killed land. That belongs to scrub brush. And when you look at the footprints of the fires that we've had where we've not gone back and reclaimed the land, and again, we can't do that these days because of these laws, you have just enormous buildups of brush, and it takes hundreds of years for the forest to reclaim that land. Mm-hmm. We decided we don't want to wait hundreds of years. We want to preserve these forests for every generation, and that's the two very different approaches. One is active scientific management, and the other is benign neglect.
Yeah. What about the water issues that we see in Central California and with farming, and is there any concern with water in the forests and the fire risks that we have? Are the same forces that are at odds of us using water for irrigation, are they at odds with us using water in any other capacity in our forests and wilderness areas?
Obviously, groundwater is extremely important for a healthy forest, and that's why you've got to be able to match the tree density to the groundwater supplies, or otherwise the forest goes thirsty and dry and dies. But the good news there is there's plenty of water coming down. If you have an overcrowded forest, though, where you have a dense canopy, the snow can't reach the ground. The snow is trapped in the dense canopy, and it evaporates rather than reaching the ground. That's why it's very important to properly space trees. One of the things you hear from the left is, oh, well, this has nothing to do with forest management. It's just it's global warming. The planet's getting warmer. Well, I don't challenge that for a moment. It's been getting warmer on and off since the last ice age. But in a warming epoch, doesn't it make sense to match the tree density to the groundwater's ability to support those trees? Doesn't it make sense to properly space the trees so snow can reach the ground and enter that groundwater supply? And if carbon sequestration is the goal, well, these forest fires make a complete mockery of all of the expensive laws that are passed to try to reduce carbon emissions. A dead or burning or decaying forest emits enormous amounts of carbon dioxide. A healthy, growing young forest consumes enormous amounts of carbon dioxide. If carbon sequestration is the goal, doesn't it make sense to remove the excess timber, mill it for lumber, where the carbon is indefinitely sequestered in that lumber? So that's the forest management side of water. But then there's still an enormous surplus that goes out to the ocean every year. Generations ago, we began building dams so that instead of that water being lost to the ocean, we could retain it for beneficial human use. It also meant that you had year-round flows on our rivers. In a summer of a drought, there's very little water in the rivers. They're reduced in this region to a trickle. In heavy rain years, you have massive floods that blow out riparian habitats. The dams, among other things, gave us year-round water flows, protected us from floods, and protected us from dry spells where the rivers just dried up. But that wasn't their principal purpose. The principal purpose was to take water from wet years so that we have and move it into dry years, to conserve all of the excess water we get in a wet year, so that we have abundant water during dry years. And the same laws that have impeded our ability to manage our forests have also impeded our ability to build new reservoirs. We haven't built a major reservoir in this state of over 1 million acre-feet since we completed the New Melones in 1979. Meanwhile, the population's nearly doubled. I chaired the House Water and Power Subcommittee for 4 years, and I'll tell you what I learned. Droughts are nature's fault. They happen. But water shortages are our fault. That's a choice that we made a generation ago when we stopped building reservoirs. Now, on top of that, we have amazingly stupid policy coming out of Sacramento. There is a order that's in the final stages of being adopted by the State Water Resources Control Board that will require 40% unimpaired flows on the San Joaquin and Sacramento systems. Now, to put that in practical terms, it means that our reservoirs on which we depend for water will be regularly drained to dead pool to meet these requirements. I mean, just an absolutely imbecile. Of course, it will devastate agriculture, but it also places our communities in risk of literally running out of water in dry years. On top of that, and people don't know this yet, but this is not some crackpot proposal that's going to be going away. You've talked about for a few weeks and going away. This is the actual law signed by Jerry Brown just about a month and a half ago. If you're an average water user, you use between 90 and 100 gallons of water a day for your residential use, to run your washing machine and your dishwasher and cook your food and all the things we do in our homes. 90 to 100 gallons a day. 2 years from now, under a law already signed, you'll be getting a notice from your local water district ordering you to cut back your residential usage to 55 gallons a day. This in one of the most water-rich regions of the country. And it has nothing to do with drought. You could be bailing flood waters out of your living room and still be subject to these requirements.
It's incredible.
This is simply insane. And this, as I said, this is already baked into the law. It's coming, and it's coming in the next 2 years.
Well, let's talk about some of the solutions. You've obviously done excellent legislation for the Tahoe Basin as far as forestry goes. Is there any legislation on the horizon that you think has a possibility of success that can fix some of our problems with water here?
Well, at the federal level, yes. In fact, my bill, which provides for streamlined permitting for new dams, has already passed the House. It's awaiting action in the Senate. That would be a huge step forward. Instead of the endless permitting where you have one agency taking several years and then another agency getting handed off to taking several years and on indefinitely. This would require all federal permitting to be run concurrently. So you would have, when a new dam needs to be constructed, you would have one agency take charge. All of the studies would run concurrently and we would get it done. Unfortunately, and that will be a major benefit for adding new water storage across the western United States. The problem in California is we have very bad water management here, as we've just been discussing. And siting new reservoirs in California is going to be very difficult until the leftist regime in Sacramento has changed.
Well, yeah, they're going to run into problems with Sacramento, right?
But I think it will, and the reason is because of that law that I just described. People don't realize it's coming at them. I've talked to very few people who are aware that this has already been signed into law. 2 years from now, they're going to get those notices.
It's going to be outrage.
I'll bet you there's going to be a revolution in the state.
I think you're probably right. At some point, they will have finally gone too far. You would have thought the gas tax would have done it,
well,
and it slightly is.
People are ticked off about that. And people need to understand, in California, we've always paid among the highest tax per gallon of gasoline in the country, and we've always ranked at the very bottom in per capita spending for our roads. So our lousy roads are not the fault of taxpayers for not paying enough taxes. They are paying through the nose for the good roads. They're just not getting them because all of that money that you pay at the pump that used to be entirely dedicated to road construction and maintenance, a lot of that's been bled off for purposes unrelated to the roads. And now they have this massive new tax increase that's gone into effect that will, again, be just as badly squandered as the high taxes we're already paying, and people finally figured that out. One Democratic senator was recalled on that issue alone in the June primary election, and because there's a referendum on the ballot, that's going to be a major issue in the upcoming November elections. And I think people are going to be looking at the policies that are coming out of Sacramento. Water rationing in one of the most water-rich regions of the country. Massive gas taxes increases in a state that already has among the highest gas taxes in the country. And then the sanctuary policies that I think people are realizing are presenting a real threat to the public safety of our communities, because the state of California is releasing dangerous criminals back into our communities rather than following the federal law and turning them over to ICE for deportation once they've served their sentences for their other crimes.
You know, on that subject, and just so our viewers know, we're going to have another segment and episode with you following this one, and we'll touch on some of those topics too.
I think people are looking at that and just saying, this is just crazy. And what's going on in California, this is pretty much what goes on in every state and every jurisdiction where the left has had undisputed control for more than 10 years. You see rising crime rates, you see failing schools, you see businesses fleeing, the same social and economic pathologies that you see in places like Chicago or New York. You're starting to see a lot of in California. Skyrocketing housing prices. I mean, I can go through the long list. That's what these leftist policies produce. And I think that, at least from what I'm hearing and sensing out there, and some of our polling's beginning to pick it up, people are getting a belly full of this nonsense.
Interesting. Well, you know, I did have a question about, with the streamlining of permitting on dams, if that legislation could get through the Senate and that become a reality, is there any difference or hindrance to hydroelectric dams if there's hydro in that dam producing clean energy?
Any dam of consequence is going to have a hydroelectric
You would believe
component.
So,
and yes, that's very much the case. And of course, hydroelectricity is the cleanest and cheapest electricity that we can possibly produce, and it can be turned on and off at a moment's notice, which is very, very important when you've got an integrated grid. The amount of electricity being drawn off that grid has to be matched by electricity being put on that grid. You know, that's why solar and wind are so expensive. You don't see those expenses when you install it, but they all require enormous amounts of backup power that has to be ready to be brought online at a moment's notice. When a cloud passes over a solar array or the wind falls off, you've got to be able to instantly replace that electricity. And one way to do it is through hydro. So that becomes all the more important with the energy policies of the state. But the most important thing is water storage. Everybody thinks that the Colorado's a great river in the West. Sacramento's bigger.
Yeah.
The difference is they store 70 million acre-feet of water on the Colorado. We only store 10 million acre-feet on the Sacramento and lose most of the rest of that to the ocean every year.
Incredible.
Yeah. So the good news is we've got plenty of water. The bad news is that someplace in the last 50 years we lost the common sense to store that water from the wet years, so we've got plenty in the dry years.
Yeah, and well, you would think it would be one more argument to convince the Enviro left to go ahead and allow for that water storage because of clean energy that's generated from it, and yet they just don't seem to be reasonable.
They've never been logically consistent. And it gets back to the question over forest management. You know, if they were really serious about sequestering carbon, the best way to do it is healthy growing forests while you're harvesting the surplus timber and milling that into lumber. That's permanent sequestration.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Well, Congressman, we're just about out of time. We got a couple minutes left, and so is there anything upcoming in the way of events or town halls that you're doing that you want the constituents to know about in the area?
I didn't bring the schedule with me. Yeah, we've got a pretty busy.
Or at least we can direct them to your website.
Absolutely, yes. The official website is McClintock.house.gov.
Okay. And then your election website, I believe, is at McClintock for Congress?
No, it's TomMcClintock.com.
TomMcClintock.com, okay. So for our viewers who are interested in some more information on these issues and your events that are going on, check out both of those websites. And I know importantly there you have an issues page that really you kind of lay out some of the solutions, the challenges and solutions on various issues that I think all of you will find very interesting. So, Congressman, thank you for joining us for this episode, and stick around because we're going to have another episode similar to this with Congressman McClintock. Thank you.
Cory, thank you.